Hello, Humanity First community, and welcome back to the Leading for Children podcast. I'm Julia Connolly, your co-host alongside Nichole Parks, who will be joining me here shortly. At Leading for Children, we're driving a movement to cultivate collaborative communities of empowered and nurturing adults, because when we are thriving, we can be who children need us to be so that they can thrive. Let's jump right into today's episode because I am so excited to share with you conversations that Nichole and I had the privilege of sharing with two community members who lead with their commitment to nurturing this sense of belonging that we know matters so much. Belonging is a word that we hear many times throughout our lives, and yet it is so rarely spoken to in its purest form. In Nichole's words, belonging is not about acceptance. It's about respect, dignity, and shared humanity. It's about recognizing that while we may be different, we are deeply connected. So belonging is not about, do I fit in and how do I fit in so I'll be accepted? Belonging is about, all of me matters here. All of me is welcomed here. And all of you matters and is welcome here. It's about creating that shared sense for each other. And so I'd like to turn now to the conversation that Nichole had with our first guest, Natasha.
Hello, friends. I am Nichole Parks. I am a mother. I am a grandmother. I'm an aunt. I am a sibling. And I am someone who really cares about the community around her. And I also have the privilege of being the executive director of Leading for Children. And I'm so excited today to have a colleague and a friend and someone who I admire join us, Natasha Kile. And Natasha, I'll pass it to you to introduce yourself.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. And the admiration is definitely mutual. So I am also a mother. I'm a daughter and a friend, hopefully a good one. I try to be. I'm also professionally a higher education professor and the current president of the Arkansas Early Childhood Association. And I've been in the field of early childhood for about 28 years. So since I was knee high to a grasshopper, really, way back in the day. So that's a little bit about me. So again, thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you for agreeing to join us. I'm really excited about the conversation that we're having together because I get to hang out with you, Natasha, and also because just being in the orbit that you're in, I happen to know that creating spaces of belonging for others means so much to you. So I'd like to get us started with just taking a moment to think about belonging in your personal or work life. What experiences or relationships feel most defining for you?
Yeah. When I think about this question, I really kind of have to go way, way back because without going into too many details, I did not have a stable childhood. I had a very, very difficult childhood, a tumultuous childhood with lots of trauma and a lot of poverty. And so, without obviously going into a lot of it, I grew up really not knowing what belonging felt like, you know, what it meant to have people who consistently show up for you, who believe in you, who take care of you, that you could really count on. And so when I found the field of early childhood education, I didn't just find a profession, I really found a community. And I found a community that really taught me about what belonging was. Because people in the field of early childhood education have this really unique ability to kind of envelop people into it. When I first got into the field, I obviously didn't get in thinking I would be in 28 years later. I got in thinking, oh gosh, this might be a good idea to help me figure out how to raise my child that I was pregnant with at the time because I didn't have any family support and I did not know how to raise a child. All I knew is how not to. And so I figured, what better way to learn how to take care of children than to go where the experts were? And so I got a job in childcare. And I did not see it as a long term career for me. And they just enveloped me. The infant teachers taught me how to change diapers and how to feed and how to survive those nighttime wakings. And the toddler teachers taught me how to survive tantrums and how to survive biting. And then the preschool teachers taught me how to teach my child about the ABCs and how to care for other people. And I mean, they just really, truly enveloped me into this true community. And I felt like for the first time in my life, I really, truly belonged somewhere. And that's probably one of the first times, like I said, that I could go back and really pinpoint a real, true place in time where I felt like, wow, I really, truly belong. The ability that professionals in the field of early childhood have to see the potential in others, to nurture growth, to create safety. The very things that we do for children, this community did for me. They saw me as someone who belonged in that field or in that place, who had something to contribute long before I even saw it in myself.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Natasha. And in what you shared, what really is resonating for me is the power that we have as individuals to create spaces and moments where people can really feel and know that they belong. And we can't walk around with assumptions that everyone already feels that, because none of us know, frankly, where the other is necessarily coming from. And so I really appreciate your sharing that, because I think for us as adults, no matter where we see ourselves or find ourselves in the young child's ecosystem, just recognizing the power that we have, and that doesn't stop as we begin to grow into adults, right? That even as adults, we can create those spaces and those moments and that sense of belonging for others.
For sure, for sure. And I think in addition to that, that responsibility that we have, right? So, yes, we have this immense amount of power, but we also have this immense amount of responsibility to make sure, like you're saying, that we're creating these spaces, not only for children, but for families, for our colleagues, even our administrators sometimes who may not know what they signed up for. I've kind of been in that situation myself, but a safe place for everybody to feel like I belong here, right? There's nobody who belongs here more than you, type of thing. And I think you're exactly right. I think it's an immense power, but I think it's also a huge responsibility as well.
Definitely so. When I think about that, Natasha, I often say that part of having a sense of belonging, when you belong in a community, you also want the people around you to know that they belong too. And so that responsibility that you talk about, it is the idea that as humans, shouldn't we want other humans to feel like they belong, right?
Yeah.
The phrase in my head was, that's your human right to
Mm-hmm.
belong.
Absolutely.
Respect. I know people say you earn respect, and my mom taught me that humans are born to be respected.
Mm, that's powerful. And I think everybody's deserving of respect. I'm dating myself now, but 25 years ago, we were taught to teach children what we call tolerance, right? To teach children to tolerate others that were different than them. And that's not the way. The way is to teach love and acceptance and belonging, right? And to teach others to, like I said, envelop others into that community so that everybody feels a part of this respectful community, this place where everybody is able to be their authentic self and they're not afraid of being rejected or being judged or being ostracized. And there are so many people in the world today that I think really struggle to find a place where they feel like they belong and that they feel like they have a community. And I feel like that's so unfortunate and leads to a lot of the issues that we have in our society for sure.
So, Natasha, already I am feeling myself growing more wise and even more committed to this idea of making sure that there are spaces where everyone feels a sense of belonging. And I'd like to invite you to talk a little bit about, why does belonging matter to you? I hear the passion, I hear the commitment, and why does it matter to you?
Yeah. It matters especially to me because I didn't have it, you know. When you live without something, the absence shapes everything, how you see yourself, what you believe you're capable of, whether you take risks, whether you speak up for yourself. It really shapes who you are. And we know that to be very true, obviously, about the early years, right? But when I think about the early childhood educators specifically, many of whom are undervalued, they're underpaid, a lot of them working in isolation, I think about how easy it is for them to internalize thoughts like, you don't matter, your work isn't important. I've been there, right? First of all, I've done the work, but I've been there with those feelings as well in different ways. I know that belonging to a professional community has a way and has the ability to say to those professionals, you matter. Your work is essential. We see you. We're here with you. It's not just something that's nice to have, it's essential, right? It's what keeps people in the field. And most importantly, it's what helps them show up fully for children. And in my experience and with my traumatic childhood that I had I not had some really strong people in my life at a young age, I could be in a very, very different situation as an adult. And here's the thing, children who don't experience belonging carry that wound into adulthood. So when we create belonging for educators, we're also creating belonging for children. The tone of voice that they use with kiddos, the way that they communicate with families, the way that they accept and not tolerate people who are different than them. And so essentially, what we're doing is we're breaking cycles. And that's why belonging really matters to me.
Thank you so much for that, Natasha. I can see that so clearly as a professional, as someone who too did not have that sense of belonging, although I had the presence of people in my life as a child who was neurodivergent way before that was even recognized. I often felt like I was on the outside looking in, surrounded sometimes by people and yet very invisible and alone. And that wound does carry forward. And that is the way that you break the cycle, thinking about how different children that I've had the privilege of having in my life, both family members through my career as a teacher, and how I was able to fully embrace them, where other people, just as I had experienced, would go, they're different, they're weird, they're this, they're that, and to just recognize how lucky am I that this child or this adult feels such a sense of belonging with me that they can be their authentic self, that they don't have to mask. And that is how you break the cycle. And I think about how I watch how my children parent their children, my grandchildren, and I see there is such a difference in the way then how I was parented, and even frankly, in some of the ways that I parented them. And it brings me joy. And
Mhm.
I appreciate you talking about that and how it's not just a gift to the adult, it's a gift to all of the people in their lives, especially the young children. And for the children that we're impacting directly, not only are we possibly changing the trajectory for them, we are really changing the future that lies ahead. And I just imagine what our world could be like if everyone could have that sense of belonging.
Oh, yes. Yes. Could you imagine? I mean, yes, absolutely. I mean, it gives me goosebumps just thinking about, right? If we lived in a world where there was no bullying, where there was no ostracization for certain types of people or certain groups of people, or if acceptance was acceptance and love was love, and just like this place where everybody was happy to be themselves and everybody was accepted by each other and everybody viewed each other as having value. Like right now, I have a t-shirt on that says care about other people. And
Mm,
my husband said, you know, you wouldn't think that's something that people need reminding about. And I said, you wouldn't think, but here we are,
yeah.
and so it's one of those things where you're like, it should be common sense, but common sense ain't always common. And so you're exactly right, Miss Nicole. It's like if we're changing the little kids' world right now, then we're changing the future. We're changing them as adults later, right? And possibly preventing this continuation, this cycle of perpetuating a society where we judge, where we hate, where we have prejudice, where we fear what we don't know, where we don't trust what's unfamiliar. There's so many things that are wrapped into that. I just have goosebumps just thinking about it. It would be amazing, and it will be amazing because we're doing it. We're doing it.
Absolutely. We are doing it. And I am almost in tears because what just pinged for me was if we had a world where everyone experienced a sense of belonging, that's a world where every human gets the opportunity to live in their fullest potential.
Hmm.
I
Absolutely.
just can't help but to think about the gifts that we're missing out on as a society because we have people walking around it that don't get to get that sense of belonging, and it creates barriers for them. Just imagine the inventions, the innovation, the creativity, the artistry. Oh my goodness. That world is going to be a glorious world to live in because, like you, I know that we're doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I know. Got me. You got me.
I try.
Yeah.
So, Natasha, we've had this opportunity to envision this world together and to acknowledge that we have peers and colleagues and families and community members that's out there that's doing this work now of creating these spaces of belonging. So, I want to invite you to think about, as a leader who brings many different people together, how do you approach creating spaces where everyone feels welcome as they are?
Hmm. I think that's such a good question because belonging doesn't look the same for every person. I really try to ask myself what would have helped me feel seen? What would have helped me believe that I had a place here? Even thinking about, gosh, when was the first time, especially in my 46-year-old memory, that I could place really feeling like I honestly belonged somewhere? What was it about that situation? What was it about that time or those experiences that made me feel that way? But I also have to recognize and remember that that's what helped me feel that way, right? That may not be what helps Julia or what helps Nichole or what helps Shannon, and part of that is, again, recognizing that belonging is not the same for everybody. So I really try to work hard to make sure that I create multiple ways for people to participate and engage, because some people like the spotlight. Some people like small groups. Some people need a one-on-one conversation. It just kind of depends on the person. I learned to find my voice gradually in spaces that I felt safe. And I say it happened gradually because it took me so long to feel safe because of the childhood that I had. I still struggle, as a 46-year-old, sometimes falling back into those habits of wondering, am I safe? But being in spaces where I've felt safe because I felt like I belonged, because I felt like part of a community, helped me to find my voice. And so I really try to build those spaces for other people to feel safe so they can find their voices as well. I also really try to be honest about the struggle. I try to tell people, hey, I screwed up. Let me just lay it all out here. When I make mistakes and I explain that, hey, I'm learning, we're learning together. And that's something that as a supervisor, I always used to say, we're figuring this out together. Don't worry, we'll get this together, because I never wanted the staff that worked for me or with me to feel like I was unwilling to do anything that they were doing. The meat and potatoes is really truly that belonging cannot happen in environments where everyone is performing perfection. Perfection is not reality, it's performative, right? You can't maintain it, it's not reality. And so when we're all constantly performing perfection, we cannot truly belong because we're not being our true, authentic selves. Real community happens when we can be authentic, capable, but still growing, learning. And part of that is making mistakes because we still need support. And part of that is being able to know that we can get that support from that community. Maybe most importantly, I really try to lead with the assumption that everybody that works with young children brings something of value to the situation, right? From the 18-year-old that just graduated high school that has zero experience, to the 20-year veteran, the whole gamut. Everybody who has a heart for working with people, I think anybody that works in the helping professions, period, I think really brings something of value to the situation. I really try to create conditions where people can show up as they are because I know I need grace, and I try to give that grace to others as well so that they feel like they're safe with me ultimately.
Thank you so much for that, Natasha. I heard so much intentionality in your approach, and I just wanted to call out some of those things for our audience. This idea of creating a safe space. And we know that that isn't a one time thing, it's continually making sure the space is safe. You also talked about individualization, recognizing that a space of belonging does not look the same for each person. We all come with our different experiences that has shaped us. And so we all have different things. And in that individualization, I heard so much respect. for the respect of the person as their authentic self. So with that, you didn't say it. I also heard getting to know people, because how do we recognize what someone really prefers without getting to know them? And then this thing that I think as leaders sometimes can feel really scary, and that is being open enough to say, hey, I messed up this time. I didn't get it right this time. Show me some grace because I promise I'm working on it. And that can be really scary for leaders. Yet, that is such a huge part of creating a safe space. It's hard for others to feel safe enough to be open and vulnerable if the creator of those spaces that's holding those spaces doesn't reciprocate the same. So I
Absolutely.
just have so much appreciation for that. So thank you for sharing that with us. And then lastly, Natasha, I want to hold space or invite you. We have a huge, diverse listening audience right now. So some of us might be professionals, some of us might be family members, some of us may be listening as grandparents or as uncles or cousins. We would have different age ranges. So, just what invitation or reminder would you offer to others who are trying to build a greater sense of belonging in their communities, whatever that community might look like or wherever it might be?
Well, with my experience, I've talked a lot about how the early childhood community gave me a sense of belonging that I never had. And as a leader, I now get to try to help create that for others. But what I would really like to leave people with is it's not just belonging or creating a community or a community of learners or, all of those kinds of catchphrases that we use today in the professional realm. But really, it's about people finding their place, their people, and their purpose, just like I did. And like I said, that's going to look different for every person. One of my favorite quotes is from Bob Marley. And he said, "The greatness of a man is not how much wealth he acquires, but in his integrity and his ability to affect those around him positively." And I feel like if you can live your life in that way, to just go out and try to affect those around you in a positive way and really accept others as they are, their true authentic selves, and do your absolute best to make the place that you're in a safe place for others and help people feel like they belong in the safe place that you've created, then I think that you're going to do wonders to go forward and create this world that we've talked so much about today. No matter what your role, no matter what age you work with, I think ultimately what I would leave everyone today with is just try to love yourself and try to love each other.
Thank you so much, Natasha, for sharing your wisdom, your presence, your passion, your commitment, all of the things that makes you you. It has been an absolute joy. I am leaving feeling optimistic and hopeful, and I hope that everyone else is leaving that way too.
Sometimes the first step to shaping the communities that we want to create for others has to do with us. Where am I coming from? What was my experience in the world? And how do I want to live my life? We now turn to our second conversation. Hello, Adriana. I am so excited to have you here with me. And I want to share a little bit of background first for our listening audience. Adriana is somebody who I met and LFC met in 2024 when we partnered with you and your team to do some evaluations of our programs and projects so that we could have a better understanding of the work that we do and how we do it so that we could do it more intentionally. And from the moment that we met and I had the honor of listening to you speak, I was so taken by your mind and your heart and how you both interpret the world and communicate your interpretation of the world and how you show up in spaces. As an evaluator, you come in from the outside and have to fast track, build trust and build a rapport so that you can understand the community and tell their story authentically. And that requires so much tact to do respectfully, and you did it. You really exemplified what it means to show up in a space in a way that contributes to the sense of belonging and encourages others to lead with that desire to nurture belonging. So I won't get too into the nitty-gritty of what our work together looked like, but all of that is to say, I just really appreciate you as an individual, as an intellectual, as a community member, as a human being. And I would love it if you could take a moment to introduce yourself, both as who you are to the people who are important to you and a little bit about your background, whatever feels important to share with us.
My name is Adriana Loson-Ceballos. My pronouns are she, her, ella. I turned 40 this year, which feels unreal, and also the age that I felt for most of my life. I was born in Mexico City. I emigrated as an infant to the border. I grew up in Chula Vista in California, in the most transited border of the world. And while I moved and lived in many cities across the US and the world, I always go back to the fact that I'm a border girl above all else. And I think that that is the biggest crucible for my identity and personality and how I see boundaries and who's in, who's out, who gets to belong, who doesn't, and what happens when we create exclusion. At a systemic level, I grew up undocumented until I was like a teeny bopper, early teens. And so deep solidarity with folks that find homes in places that don't necessarily welcome them and what that ultimately does. And what happens to society on the margins has always been really a comfortable space for me. I went to Catholic schools later in my educational journey. So I did a lot of social volunteering through my education, which I think opened me up to nonprofits and community leaders and community organizing and taking care of one another and mutuality and how we show up for one another. It also opened me up to philanthropy as a scholarship kid and what it really looks like to be generous and to inspire generosity. And I stayed in school from the age of 3 to 33, going straight from undergrad to master's to PhD to now I teach. So there's a part of me that's always in the classroom. And even though I have a whole profession beyond academia, because I don't belong in academia and I was never made to feel like I belonged there, I'm very interested in the creation of knowledge and doing that with community. And I'm an only kid, and that has meant that like I'm always hosting my own version of tea parties, even in my profession. So when I decided to be a consultant 5 years ago, I was like, I don't want to have a boss, but I also don't want to do this alone. And so I started a consulting cooperative for Midnight Consulting. And it's been wonderful to be in spaces where we are trying to, in some ways, exist within racialized capitalism, but by creating our own safety through the solidarity economy. We've survived through really tough years. And last year was not an exception. And I appreciate that that's a space where I have that. And I'm also very into collective giving and other spaces where we can be in relationship with one another and build our own sense of community and belonging beyond our immediate family and offices in ways that build our social fabric. So that's who I am. And beyond that, I am a mother, a daughter, and I like to think that I'm also a friend that usually forgets your birthday, but will be there when you really need her.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Adriana. What a rich and beautiful perspective that you are bringing to this conversation. I think it's so interesting how it kind of combines insider knowledge from lived and felt experiences being on the margins, and then kind of the academic outsider looking in expert, expert in quotation marks, because of course that's a subjective term, but you know what I mean. You have this really comprehensive and intimate relationship with the concept of community and belonging. And so I'm really grateful to be having this conversation with you. And I appreciate that these ideas that we don't generally spend a lot of time or put a lot of value or resources into exploring are just a part of who you are and what you bring to every space that you enter and of the work that you do. You shared a little bit about your journey, and I'm wondering if there are specific moments or relationships or experiences that you feel kind of set the model for you and showed you what belonging can actually look and feel like, especially since you've described feeling like you don't belong too.
Yeah, I think that that's an important question, and I'm going to nerd for a bit. My undergrad is in political science and French, and I did my master's in human rights and my PhD is in leadership. And that all matters in some way because it really is all about like the common space, right? Like how we relate to one another and how we take care of one another and what's the bare minimum and what can be aspirational and how do we navigate between where we are and the world we want. And I think that that was something that was really important about leading for children. And the humanity first model was that, for me at least, it was really clear how much, and we put this in the report, how much intention unlocks empowerment. And this idea that when we set clear intentions for ourselves, there is the opportunity for our actions to constantly be anchored back to and filtered by that intention. And it allows for emotional regulation that protects relationships. It allows for deep introspection that allows for personal growth and transformation. It allows for collaboration, all the things that we know are so important and cascade from it. And I say that to say that when I was at Columbia doing my master's in human rights, one of the first institutions to really make sure I didn't feel like I belonged, there was a class on identity and human rights. And I remember basically understanding that your identity has three layers, right? It's like how you see yourself, how your group sees you, and how the people beyond your group see you. And when you factor in Latineity and Latinidad in that perspective, and you know how much we can be guilty of internalizing things like anti-Blackness, homophobia, anti-indigeneity, all these things, like to be a Latina that is white versus a Latina that is Black versus a Latina that is gay, it's going to be very different how people within your group might see you and how you might be perceived within your own community. But then there's also the external community, right? Like as a white presenting Latina, like I may have grown up undocumented, but I didn't have the same fears or the same exclusion that some of my peers would have had, especially speaking English so fluently, right? And I also speak Spanish fluently. So when I went back home, nobody was like, oh, the American has arrived. Everybody assumed and continues to assume you are Mexican, right? And like, that is what you are. And also you lived in the States, but you are Mexican. And so it's been really interesting to sort of like morph and have to learn how to culture shift in ways that allow me to sneak into doors that would have, if aware, closed on me. But I think what has been different, I would say, in the last 10 years, at least for me on a personal level, has been where do I intentionally seek community? And where do I intentionally show up fully and authentically and as my whole self without trying to like act like I belong with the Real Housewives of Mexico City or the white academics who are quote unquote like on their equity journey? Like, where do I get to be Adriana? Adriana walked in the door and she arrived fully. And that has been a very intentional journey for me that has unlocked a sense of empowerment for myself as a Latina that I think has really allowed me to experience a sense of, in Spanish, it's a verb called convivir, which is con vivir. There isn't an English translation for it, but what it means is basically cohabitating in life, where we get to be together, like the act of being, but we also make space for highs, lows, and change. I've had to curate those spaces for me, not to create echo chambers, but to create these sites for healing, rediscovery, remembering, and like rematriation of my identity has been a very intentional practice.
The word intersectionality is coming up for me, and I'm thinking about the tendency for mainstream society to slowly become comfortable with singular identity markers and life experiences and backgrounds or lifestyles, for the lack of better words, I guess, and that having differences is tolerable in small doses. And for those of us who don't fit the narrow confines of what is accepted in society, we can either contort ourselves or minimize ourselves in order to be accepted. Or, as you were describing, we can live fully and authentically and find spaces, actively find spaces where we can do that. And it's so interesting to me how so much of how we individually choose to show up is in response or reaction to the way we're received and other people's comfort levels. And so I really appreciate hearing you talk, Adriana, about living in a more proactive and more intentional way and shaping the life that you want to live and the community that you want to be surrounded by. And I know sometimes this isn't possible because it's about safety and survival, but it's a very hopeful aspiration to hear that there is a way to do it. And so I appreciate that.
And being unapologetic of the iterations of yourself. Because the moment you forget your own personal growth, the moment that you lose empathy for others in their own growth and in their own journey. And so I joke, like, I have amazing friends in different eras of my life that know different Adrianas, that even if you get them in the same room, they wouldn't get along because they'd be like, how are you friends with them? Right. But when I get to be with a group that I was friends with in Montessori versus high school versus college versus grad school versus your first job out of college versus internships versus whatever it is, it's like I get to revisit. It's like you get a stamp in your passport of yourself to check back in on 16-year-old Adriana, check back in on 21-year-old Adriana, check back in and be like, oh my God, remember when yes, that was a version of me. And there's huge relief in some of these friendships that, like, they may not be the friends that I talk to every day or the relationships that I talk to every day, but there is this sense of I can be and stretch certain muscles with old relationships that I think is important to my own personal archive of learning and growth.
I'm curious if you had to kind of extract themes or qualities from the people who created that space for you or allowed you to explore the different parts of yourself. Could you maybe describe what it was about them or the space that they created, or maybe how it felt to you that was really the essence of belonging?
I think, and I was very specific when I was like, I'm the friend that will forget your birthday, but you can call on as needed. Like, activate me and I am there. And I say that to say that the groups of friends or the groups of coworkers or the groups of cohorts or networks, like when we are collectively holding a space where all of us can tap in, tap out, engage in, opt out, those have been the most successful spaces for me to feel like I can show up. And when they have ceased to be that, I may have one or two friends that I keep from that group, but I don't show up to any of the group settings anymore. I don't know if this is the Mexican in me that, like, when all my friends were getting ready for the 10-year high school reunion, I was like, who wants to go back to their high school? And my high school was great and I loved it because I went to an all-girl high school and I joke, but it was a phenomenal school and, like, deeply formative and, like, absolutely wonderful. Shout out to Our Lady of Peace. But to that point, when I was doing my PhD in leadership studies, the amount of definitions that we had to read about, like, leadership that come up over, like, 7 years of studying leadership. So I don't know who said this, but I know I didn't come up with those. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is not my definition, but I've adopted it as my own. Leadership is deeply interpersonal, but it's really about what happens in the space between us. And we all hold a space. And so those are important conditions that I pay attention to. And it's usually what people are like, I don't know what the secret sauce is, but it just feels great. And I'm like studying the ingredients, the molecular makeup of that space between us, what it actually looks like to make values feel like verbs. And so those are the conditions, and I can study the homeostasis of that condition.
Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating. You know, at Leading for Children, we often talk about leadership in terms of all of us being leaders, and, you know, that it doesn't require a position of authority or power to lead, but simply by existing in shared spaces and having an impact on other people, we are leaders. And how we show up in those spaces, how we step into that power and channel our values and allow them to inform the the way that we show up, that is the leadership stance. And so like you're saying, that space in between us, leadership doesn't happen in a silo, obviously. There's somebody on the other end. And I think it's so powerful to spend time with that dynamic, and sometimes can be uncomfortable, right? Because so much of life is basically our stuff bumping up against other people's stuff, our upbringings, our traumas, our good stuff, all of that bumping into each other. And because that can feel uncomfortable, I think sometimes there's a resistance as a collective, as individuals and as a collective, to explore that space between. And with that comes fear, and where there's fear, there's exclusion. And so we make ourselves tight and restricted and pull away instead of really leaning in and nurturing relationships and stepping into our power in a way that cultivates that kind of connection and community spirit that we want to have. And so I really appreciate you calling attention to that space between and really honoring the exploration of what really is in there and how it shapes our feelings.
And if I can just dive off of what you're saying, I think that that's what made the mutual learning to me so interesting, because to your point, like leadership is a positional, right? There's positional authority and there's leadership, and those two don't necessarily have to be even concentric circles, right? Like they could just be two separate circles. There could definitely be overlaps for sure. But I think what we were able to discern in the evaluation that looked across projects, intention is definitely really important to unlock empowerment, but that personal reflection is like that first step of transformation. But that there is this importance to the safety and the structure of the mutual learning method that creates shared ownership so that people can actually speak up. Because that's something that for me, who has studied and does evaluations on these types of projects and collective efforts, community-based learning really requires that we all speak up, right? And that lived experience, professional experience, all these types of experiences and forms of knowledge matter. And that we move past this like Enlightenment era thinking that only that which is observed in nature and scientifically validated by, like endless observational anecdotes matters. Like, no, like we know, and we have so many different ways of knowing. And can we not let the biggest personalities in the room be confused for leaders and instead make space for those voices? Because it really is in that mutual learning space that power is redistributed and that power is shared. And that becomes deeply, deeply transformative. And that's why it is much more this collective leadership space that allows us to feel like we can lean into the growth, grieve what we lose when we grow, right? And start to feel like our voices belong in that space. And what we have to say matters not just to ourselves, but to other people. I think that's deeply important to the topic at hand.
Yes, yes, yes. Yesterday, Jonathan, who is my LFC colleague, and many of you know him as a program leader, we're talking about a blog that we're writing together about belonging. And he actually referenced you before he knew that we were talking today. And he pulled up the report, and particularly the sentence that you wrote about the pathway of transformation. And I'll read it really quick so our audience has the privilege of hearing your beautiful insight. You said, "The pathway of transformation, beginning with inner shifts in reflection and voice, moving through relational growth and group culture, and extending outward into system-level change and visionary possibility." And he and I were both like, oh my goodness, that is so poignant, because it's not often, I think, that we really get to spend time at each level. And we do have to slow down and look at ourselves first and figure out, what is my voice? What do I need and want to say? And then test it out in a group, right? See how it feels to say it loud and how it lands for everyone else, and receive feedback. And that's where you learn to value yourself, and you find out other people value you. And there's such a power that comes with that then can be translated into deeper systemic changes. And so Jonathan and I were both just so curious. He asked me to ask you, how did you get to those words? Where did they come from?
I remember there was a part that when I wrote it, like I was like, oh, wow, that is true. That culture change is the front door to systems change. And we hear this phrase that, again, not mine, someone said it, that culture is what eats policies for breakfast, right? As someone who has helped endless organizations and collectives and collaboratives and networks navigate their own internal change, whether it's through a strategic plan or a business model realignment or a merger or whatever it is, I think that there is this incredibly important moment where we forget that change is this adaptive challenge. It's not a technical challenge. If you have a technical challenge, like hire the right technician, right? Like if you need heart surgery, hire someone who is a doctor that can do heart surgery. But when we're talking about behavioral change, like personal change, identity change, relational change, that is like culture change. It's one step forward, two steps to the left, 10 steps back, do-si-do, move ahead, move back, jump out, jump back in. Like it is all over the place. And anyone who's gone through a divorce will tell you that, right? There's a really important phrase in the divorce world, like irreconcilable differences. There are points where you just cannot reconcile the grief of personal transformation or change or people not changing or this or that. It can make or break any type of a relationship, not just deeply personal. It can break organizations. And so I say that to say that I've seen movements falter that aren't able to navigate the grief that comes with change. And as a result, there could be these amazing social movements out there that just fall short of making actual social change. And I have always kind of wondered why that is. And there was this opportunity with Leading for Children to talk to so many participants across projects and across learning networks. What was bubbling up was that in this space that people were holding for one another, there was deep personal transformation that was happening, but there was culture that was being like made and sustained and that was like flowing out from that group and flowing into the classrooms and flowing into different school systems and flowing into, and that was the first time that I could very clearly see the connection between that personal transformation and that cultural change. And when I was able to really sit with culture change, I was able to see how it affects systems change. But I think that there is definitely a much clearer through line of the ripple effects. And it makes me think of Eleanor Roosevelt's quote that said something like, world peace starts at home. And feminist scholarship has talked about how the personal is political. But I think that there is definitely a lot of that resurfaced as I'm thinking about your model and your impact.
Yeah, thank you for kind of zooming out on the mutual learning method and humanity first model and why we need these cultural spaces of belonging if we want systems to change or even just sustain. You know, Jonathan and I were talking about his experience during a project a few years back and how it surprised him that by holding these kinds of spaces, some really hard things were elicited. And it kind of caught him off guard how much people ended up utilizing the opportunity to kind of unravel some things that had been weighing them down, and maybe they didn't have another space to explore or share them in, and maybe they didn't even have a formula for how to go about doing those things. So things would come up where the person might say, I haven't even shared this with my spouse, or my child and I are having this tension that's really uncomfortable. And it brought to light that every single human is sitting on heavy stuff, and if we don't have a culture that supports navigating that, and we don't, we have a culture that looks to the light at the end of the tunnel, which is great, but also there's a whole tunnel in between where we are now and that light. And so we have to find a way, we have to be comfortable with the tunnel part too. And I think the reason that your sentence about transformation came up, Adriana, was because we were talking about how it's amazing what happens when you say the hard thing and when trust begins to develop. And when people start to see each other's hard stuff and see each other's humanity in a way that isn't normally shared. But what if it was normally shared, right? And when you are vulnerable with someone, often what happens is they let their guard down and they might be vulnerable with you too. And so that vulnerability piece is so powerful. And what you're saying about irreconcilable differences and how they can sometimes make or break communities, I'm just thinking about how true it is that we often find ourselves in communities we don't necessarily want to be in. Like, if you think about people who work 9-to-5 jobs 5 days a week for all of their working adulthood, and, they might not love the people that they're surrounded by, but that's our life, right? That is our time, and we want to feel ownership of it. We want to feel good in it. There's such an energy exchange that we all have when we share spaces. One of the things we talk about at LFC is how do we make these spaces more welcoming of the full human experience, where we can show up as our full selves and share that sense of belonging. We don't necessarily explicitly use the word belonging a whole lot, but I think it is an underpinning concept here. It's one of the biggest points. And I'm curious, in your observation of different systems and organizations, are there themes that you have seen support folks as they navigate differences and hopefully make them not irreconcilable?
I have a very funny friend who has this well, it's what's for lunch. And in some ways, she's very much old school stoic in that there's this acceptance of those moments and those spaces where we would not choose it, but it's what's for lunch. There is opportunity for us to exercise leadership and affect change. But I think where that most can happen is if we show up and if we speak. My daughter has this beautiful story, The Day You Begin, by Jacqueline Woodson. And there's a part where she's this young Black girl who everybody comes back from summer vacation and people went to all these amazing places. And she thinks that she's not going to belong because she stayed home and had an amazing summer with her sister. And so she's nervous when it's her turn to share. And she says her sister's name. And someone in the class goes, "That's my sister's name." And they immediately bond over having a little sister. So even in moments where you think, I'm not going to belong, there is an opportunity to say, but what if I do? But what if this space is made for me? But what if I actually find a reason to be in space with these people? One of my dear, dear friends from one of the boards that I'm on, she says, I'm okay losing people over the why, but I'm not okay losing people over the how. I'll give you the example of trying to stop the expansion of the border wall and working with Latinos, the local Kumeyaay, indigenous population, farmers who let their animals graze on both lands, who might themselves have voted a certain way, the people who are more interested in the wild cats and the ecosystem than the human lives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? All these people that you might think have nothing in common and might rarely be able to vote on anything in particular may not want this wall to exist for whatever the reason. The why is we don't want this wall to exist. And we can figure out the how of collaborating with one another. And that I think is something that this world is losing, which is the ability to practice that lowercase d democracy of how do we disagree and yet collaborate in service of what we can agree upon. And those are muscles that you have to practice. We need to create spaces like the mutual learning method spaces that you all create where we can practice that thing.
I so appreciate how you're highlighting the need for really relearning how to be together and then for practicing that because it's not the default. We didn't all grow up with that being the norm and haven't all practiced it throughout our lives. And so these are kind of new skills and new values, and we know how important they are for shaping healthier communities where we can be healthier adults. And then by extension, we can raise healthier children. So I'm wondering if, as we wrap up here, you want to speak any more to the why it matters question, more personally as a mother, as a friend, as a human, and then maybe offer an invitation or takeaway message for our listening audience.
I've started to allude to the fact that it's deeply important that we work on ourselves. It's more important that we work with one another. And it's even more important that we do so now. And I think that the rallying cry of so many Latino movements are El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. The people united will never be defeated. And, like Dr. Powell and others out of Berkeley are much more well versed in the importance of reducing the circle of others and increasing the circle of belonging. And I think of amazing recent books like Hallie Lee's The Big We and others that are really pushing us to expand how we think about a collective and our sense of mutuality and how deeply interlinked our liberations are, that it is incredibly important that we have spaces and models and communities where we can personally and collectively transform. I remember when I started to hire people on my team as a fundraiser, one of the questions that I asked interviewees was, when was the last time you wrote a thank you note? Or when was the last time you said thank you? And it solicited really interesting responses and self reflection. And I think that there's this opportunity to think about, when was the last time I did something with someone I disagree with? When was the last time that I was able to fully listen? I think we really need to listen more deeply. And I think we need to do things with other people. It doesn't matter how big or how small it is. I heard someone call it anarchist calisthenics, right? Where you just like do the calisthenics of like, that rule is useless, it's immoral, and it's unimportant. And so I'm going to practice what it feels like to break that rule so that when I'm breaking important rules that really matter, like getting into the good trouble that Representative Lewis, may he rest in power, called us to do, that we knew how to do it. And so when our democratic institutions are being tested, like, have we practiced lowercase d democracy? Have we practiced doing things with one another? Have we done those calisthenics? And to do that, and to do that with people.
Ooh, I've never heard it described like that before. The lowercase democracy in order to practice uppercase democracy. That's so cool. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and helping us understand that, yes, belonging matters so much. And the way that each of us shows up as leaders matters so much, because we can't do the big work of systemic change without the little work that goes into cultural change. And no matter where you fit in society, no matter what your experiences have or haven't been around belonging, it still matters, and you have the power to create that for somebody else. I'd like to bring us into the final part of our conversation and offer a question for you to ponder as you transition into the next part of your day. Who in your community might need their sense of belonging nurtured right now? And how might you begin to show up for them? Belonging is a living and breathing sense, and it is all of our responsibilities to look for it for ourselves and to shape it for others. Thank you so much for being a part of our community and listening to our show. Together, we're creating space to see more of each other and more of ourselves. Please subscribe to the Leading for Children podcast on your favorite streaming platform. You can also visit leadingforchildren.org to sign up for newsletters and explore ways to get involved. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your commitment to shaping thriving communities for children. Wishing you optimism. Till next time.